Hello everyone, welcome to Black Fog, your guide for drifting off. I know you listen to help you fall asleep, so like and subscribe to Black Fog before we start. Where are you from and what's your time? Now get comfortable and relax. The window was black as the void, just like every day. It always caught my eye on the way home from work. Although I knew it was better not to look, I couldn't help myself. When I got inside, I stood in front of the door, as I did most days, eyes locked on the handle but not daring to open it. I wanted to. By God, I wanted to. I wanted to open the door and turn the lights on and be done with it. I wanted to stop this room from making the whole house feel darker. I just couldn't. I didn't have it in me. That's how it had gone, day after day, year after year. The room had not always been dark. Actually, once sunlight would stream through the single large window, making the room shine to all walking past. That was before it settled in. I began hearing noises. First, they were small, scuttering and scratching like rats or bugs. Over time, the light in the room began to fade until it became the pitch black that it remained for so long, until it started to leak out. I noticed a dripping sound. Leaky ceilings and pipes sprung to mind, but it didn't take very long to find the source. There was a black spot on the wall next to the door of the room. It wasn't much bigger than a coin, and sound itself was owed to a black liquid occasionally falling from it in little droplets. The liquid was hitting the floor and had pooled into a small puddle. As I watched the droplets fall and feed the puddle, I noticed they were not immediately absorbed, as you would see with water. Instead, they sat on top of the pool for a moment until, after a pause, they were snatched inside the greater body. The image made my stomach turn. Although I didn't know what type of substance this was, I knew that it must be carrying the same darkness that engulfed the room. Until this point, I had been safe with just leaving the door firmly shut. Now, it seemed that such physical barriers were no longer enough to keep that darkness contained. Suddenly, I heard something else. A second drip. I could see it then, not far away from the first leak, but further up the wall. Fell not far from the first pool. It wouldn't be long until the two pools met. My skin felt cold. I felt my breathing get faster and small beads of sweat start to pool on my brow. I took a step back. I didn't want to take my eyes off them, but I also didn't want to be here any longer. I took another step back. The two dripping leaks looked like the malformed eyes of a predator. I thought if I moved too fast that it might pounce. Another step back. A third dripping sound now came, disrupting the predictable rhythm of the first two. I couldn't see where this one was coming from though. I froze. I thought backing away could be making it worse, making the predator angrier. I couldn't go forward either, so I just stopped and waited. It was then I saw the liquid seeping out from the bottom of the doorway into the room. My house was getting wetter and darker, and, as it did, the life and soul within began to depart. The dripping began to get more regular as more and more spots began to form and join in the chorus. The sound started to get faster until there were dozens of steady streams running black tar onto my floor like unchecked sewer pipes. I sensed what was coming, so turned on my heel and tried to flee. I had just taken my first step when I heard the sound of a door opening behind me. It was not the bursting open of a door swung open by the pressure of a torrent of liquid, but the rattle of a handle followed by the slow creak of unused hinges. Next came the heavy and deliberate rumble of something moving heavily and quickly across my floor and right towards me. I could hear my heart beating in my ears as I took off in a sprint. Whatever unnatural force pursued me, it was fast, lumbering after me with frightful speed. I needed to get out of that house, this much I knew. As hard as I ran towards my front door, it got closer and closer, and the more distant my escape felt. My house had not been this big before, I was sure of it. However, my certainty seemed not to matter very much in that moment. It was like I was running towards a goal that did not want to be reached, that would not let me catch up. Suddenly, I felt something cold and wet completely wrap around my torso and lock me in place. I stopped trying to run. I just froze again, a deer waiting for the impact, waiting for whatever would happen next. I could hear it breathing in my ear. It was like the strained wheezing of breath almost completely obstructed by phlegm. It popped and crackled as it drew closer and closer to my face. Now that I was caught, whatever presence this was didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. I felt the pressure around my middle increase as it started to squeeze. The bulking mass behind me pressed up against my back. Then I felt its moist substance running over my shoulders. The rest of my body followed, around my waist, my legs, and between fingers. Finally, violently, and without warning, it pulled me back and I was enveloped completely inside it. It was a strange feeling, both weightless and heavy. My body felt numb from the shock, which until then had kept me frozen. Unfortunately, the shock was starting to wear off and the reality of it all dawned on me. I felt everything then. My skin felt hot and cold simultaneously, burning and freezing in equal measure. The being's insides were pulsating and bubbling across every tiny part of my body. I couldn't breathe as the thick and oozing matter around me would not even let me expel my breath through my nose. When I felt myself fading, I focused all my effort into forcing my mouth open. I did this not to breathe, but to scream. However, instead of letting out my terror, I let it in instead. It was like drowning in a pit of tar. Hot, cold matter entered every orifice on my face in a gushing stream, relentlessly filling my insides with its darkness. I was throwing up in reverse. My ears, like sand, was being forced deep inside. My eyes, like they were being shredded by a million tiny diamond shards. It was torture of the worst kind. The ordeal, however, was only just beginning. Just as the discomfort and pain was at its crescendo, I began to fade from reality. At first, I found myself praising whatever gods were listening that my body could not be turned against me anymore. It was a respite against the torment, which had already passed the point of being unbearable. What took its place, though, was worse than tangible things like pain. Initially, it was just a whisper. It was hardly perceptible, but quickly grew in its volume and harshness. It spoke with words, although not those of any earthly language. It told me of my uselessness, my burden to the world, and that I would be better off dead. Although unpleasant to hear, they are something else when felt. Before long, it was as though daggers were scratching the very core of my mind, the essence of my being. Every disembodied flick of its tongue burned deeper and deeper into me. It was scratching away at me, one alien syllable at a time. It didn't take long for me to start begging to return to mere physical pain. I'm not sure how I was able to endure this depraved onslaught, but somehow I did not give in. I did not, and still don't, consider myself a strong man, but despite my own expectations, I did not surrender. It would have been so easy to just succumb to the madness and let myself slip away. I very nearly did. Right when the whispers and pain could not get any worse, I felt myself snap. I was no longer a version of myself I could recognize. I was separated from myself, and although that pain was still very real, I felt removed from it in some way. The human mind can only take so much, and this was the equivalent of curling up into a shell and hoping it did not shatter under the force of the assault. In any other situation, I suppose the above would sound worrying. Rest assured, though, because it was my loss of sanity that, in a way, actually saved me from my own desire to give in. I could not want any more. I could not do much of anything except grip the metaphorical rope under the downpour of the mightiest waterfall I could imagine. This went on for some time, but how much I could not say. All I know is that against the thunderous roar of the entity's barrage, everything gradually faded to white. I mean that in a literal sense. The darkness that surrounded me started an imperceptible shift that I only realized when the sensation was blinding. With that light, so too did the mountainous noise of the entity fade to a whisper, and then to nothing at all. And that was it for some time. Total nothingness, total numbness. I was just a speck suspended in the total void. It sounds bizarre to say now, but there was a comfort in that nothingness that I will never forget. I felt like I had done it, I had won. That would not be so accurate to say. The reality is that I had done the only thing I could do. I had weathered the storm. The next thing I saw was the image of my old and unvarnished wooden floors against the backdrop of my open front door, light pouring through it and lighting up the dim surroundings. It felt like the worst hangover I could ever have, punishing me for a night out I didn't get the chance of having. My bones ached, my eyes twitched, and my skin felt like it was on a body too big. I let out a raspy moan and tried to collect myself, but that proved difficult. Through more than a bit of willpower, I forced myself to sit upright and steadied myself on my arms. That was when, also like a terrible morning after, the day's events came flooding back to me. My stomach lurched and I felt something needed to be expelled from the depths of my core. Instinctively, I shut my eyes, opened my mouth to my side, and let it all out. Although not quite painful, it certainly wasn't pleasant. It went on for some time, and just when I thought it was all out, I would heave again and begin the process anew. Finally, when I had nothing more to give, I remained perched on locked arms which had thankfully not given way. I could feel my expulsion pooled around my hands, and I did not want to open my eyes to deal with what came next. I took my time and opened them when I was ready. Bile as black as midnight. It was all around me. It seemed to bubble and shudder of its own accord. I could not stand it. I struggled to my feet and started to run. I ran as fast as I could right out of that house, and I did not look back, no matter how far out of sight it was. Despite my weakness and state of filth, I kept going. I ran and ran until I reached the home of some family who were kind enough to take me in without asking too many questions, even though I'm sure they were burning to ask. I stayed with them for some time. I couldn't go back, there was no way. Eventually, I made up a story about sewerage and some leaky pipes. It seemed to satisfy their worry. Although I'm sure they didn't completely believe me, they kept any more questions to themselves and let me move on as best I could, learning to keep any mention of the house out of their mouths. It never strayed too far from my mind in any case. Eventually, I moved out and into an apartment. The house was paid off, I didn't need to worry about it. I thought about selling it, but that would have meant dealing with it directly, perhaps even being asked to see it, and I couldn't have handled that. No, instead I just left it there, decaying year after year. At some points, I even forgot it existed. Even so, without fail, every couple of months I would cough up some more black bile. It always seemed to happen when I had just forgotten about it. There it would be again. It doesn't happen anymore. It hasn't for quite some time. I'm thankful of that. Last month, I was walking absent-mindedly. There was a song playing in my headphones, and my eyes started following a bird. The unconscious smile on my face dropped like a lead weight when the small creature flew over the same house I had tried so hard to forget for so long. As it set itself down on the roof, totally ignorant of the terror that lay inside, I felt my chest tighten. My breathing picked up, and I could feel my heart start to pound that terrible yet familiar beat. I felt the urge to run, just as I had all those years ago, but something stopped me. I caught sight of that window, the same one that had been ever so bright so long ago. It was still dark as it had been, yet something was different. Dimly, I could see the shadow of something waving from the windowsill. For a split second, I thought it was the darkness, waving and beckoning its escaped prey to return back to its clutches. On closer inspection was something entirely unexpected. I could see the unmistakable silhouette of a stem, leaves, and a halo of petals subtly moving from side to side against the cool day's breeze. It was a flower very much alive, which had not been there before. I could not make heads or tails of where it had come from or what it was doing there, but there was one thing I could be completely sure of. The darkest room in my house was now just a little bit brighter. The furthest back I can remember is still not far enough. Sometimes, if I strain myself, reach deep past my skull and into the folds of my brain to tug on a few things, I can remember the sound of the trunk falling closed. A sudden thump that cut off the world and everything in it. A sound that I imagine was not unlike what one would hear after being hit in the back of the head with something hefty. Before that, though, there's nothing much I can really recall. I don't remember why exactly I was dumped in the trunk, although I'm fairly certain I did not choose to do this to myself purely because, for the love of God, who would? I have no idea what kind of night I was having oh so long ago before I wound up in the trunk. I don't remember if I'd spent it at the bar, or at the club, or my house, or my nan's, or the goddamn grocery store. I don't remember. I have no clue where the car was when I was thrown into its trunk either. And for that matter, I don't even know what make or model the car was. Could have been a Lexus, a Prius, a Mustang, a Charger, a Mazda. Could have been black or blue or white or red or fucking electric pimp green for all I know. But what I do know for certain is that it was a car. I know because from the inside out, I can tell it had to have been something small, something cruel. Something like a sedan or a Corvette or something else with a trunk barely the size of a small man. There was a time when I did remember all those things. Those crucial days of infancy before I began to cross over. I had a phone back then, and back then I was an idiot. Instead of rationing my fragile time with it to extend its life as far as I could into the countless millennia that would come to pass, I drained the last of the battery alternating between calls with loved ones and the police, neither of whom ever found me, and neither of whom I can even really remember now. But none of that is important anyway because things like names and faces and the makes and models of cars all belong to the old world, and I started scratching to write about the new. In short, the transition over to what I have come to believe as the afterlife was a difficult one, and I believe it will be difficult for the vast majority of people as well. Really, I believe it will be worse than difficult. It will be unbearable. I have no idea what I would have done if I went into the trunk a claustrophobe, a religious man, a maniac, or God forbid a sane man. If I were any of those things, I likely would have never wandered my way back to a steady thought. The crossover is a slow, painful, agonizing journey, but a journey that I unfortunately suspect is mandatory for anybody who chooses to be buried. So, if any of what follows disturbs, upsets, or bothers you in any way, and you also happen to be expecting to die soon, I highly suggest making arrangements with your local crematorium as soon as you can. That, and do a little research on the Egyptians. They were onto something. The culture believed, or somehow foresaw perhaps, that it would be necessary to bury their dead with an assortment of objects to carry over with them to the other side. They figured that wherever they were headed, that they might as well be prepared for what was to come. It was common practice to bury with themselves, among other things, a full assortment of tools, farming equipment, all types of food, bowls, various utensils, both decorative and non-decorative urns, currency, and of course what they're most known for burying themselves with, a metric fuck-ton of jewelry. You can do without the jewelry. You can do without most of the things I mentioned, really. I only mention the Egyptians at all because yes, they were right in concept, but not necessarily in practice. Their intention was right on the money, but their execution fell short. They buried these things with themselves to prepare for the destination, for the life they believed they would go on to live after crossing over, when really they should have been packing things to kill time during the journey. Because sure, the food and the tools and the money of course would be great to have once you actually arrive in the afterlife. But what in the hell are you going to use to pass the time, the unfathomable amount of time, getting there? Dice? A deck of cards? This was the question I wish I knew to ask myself when first taking inventory of the trunk. Over the course of my first few hours in the trunk, in my would-be tomb, my shag sarcophagus, I quickly became acquainted with the items I would unknowingly spend the rest of eternity with. My burial goods. There was of course my phone, a half-full plastic water bottle, a glob of gum stuck in the carpet, a subpar nude magazine, an empty handgun, a thumbtack, and $40 split between 5 fives, a tenner for ones, and a handful of change. I took stock of these things using quick and efficient bursts from my phone's light in between my frantic calls for help, flashing it around the trunk like a coked-out paparazzi photographer fiending for an angle. By morning, when my flashlight snuffed itself out along with the life of my phone, I was plunged into the dark. It wasn't until the sun rose to noon the following day that I realized I could see again. In the center of the top of the trunk was a small hole about the size of a couple pinpricks, nothing big enough to see out of, but just large enough to let enough light in the trunk to see with. It shone like a spotlight down onto the black carpeting, and just barely illuminated my array of burial goods as they hid away in their respective corners of the trunk. Before long, I curled around that light like a curtain, and just like that, I had my stage. And so I began to play. The water bottle went first. I hooked it into the light and guzzled its contents after resisting thirst for a whole 30 minutes. Objectively, it was a stupid decision to make from a survival standpoint, but seeing as how things turned out, it wouldn't have really mattered how long I stretched the water. Eventually, after a certain point, I found that I could only get so thirsty. I could only get so hungry. My needs would inevitably plateau. Next up on stage was the foam. Now that it was dead and had no other immediate use than it being a blunt object, I tried in vain to bash both at the lock on the trunk and at the spotlight hole. Both attempts were overwhelmingly unsuccessful. The thumbtack was more of the same. I tried puncturing holes in the metal where I could, and for about 5 minutes I was actually making some good progress with it, but then the plastic bit snapped off and I was left with only a microscopic sharpened rod. I couldn't for the life of me manage to puncture anything with that. The money, of course, was fitting but useless. Hopefully the afterlife takes cash. I have yet to find a place that even recognizes the concept of money at all, let alone the concept of a singular place. Everything blends together here into a dark, bright slurry, more or less. Not much room for a 7-Eleven, but then again, too much room for a 7-Eleven. The handgun being empty was something I actually found to be extremely funny after a couple years. For the longest time, I resisted the urge to touch the thing. I didn't even look at it until roughly 3 days had passed. I was on my last legs and the hunger and the thirst had begun to really gnaw at me. And I was so afraid of the weapon because had it not been empty, had it been loaded, I could have escaped. It wasn't a way out of the trunk, sure, but it was in fact a way out. Either way, I'm getting ahead of myself again. It's hard not to. I'll get to the gun. Naturally, after acknowledging the handgun's presence, I took a break to read the nude magazine. I read it cover to cover just to pass the time, scanning it back and forth under the pinhole's light a little like a human copy machine. Try as I might though, it was impossible to see entire images at once, and so I had to rely on my memory to make up the cover in its entirety. Reading that magazine, reconstructing the images from their fragments in my memory was one of my first exercises in abusing my imagination, and it would not be the last. Regardless, after I finished the magazine, I was left a little unsatisfied. Then came the tears and the first rumbles of maddening laughter. When the pinhole darkened, marking the end of my first full day in the trunk, I knew already that my time was running thin. The human body could only sustain itself for so long, and so long happened to be right around the corner. 3 days is about the maximum a man can go without water. That meant I had about 2 days to live, give, or take how much time the half-empty water bottle bought me. 2 days to get out. 2 days to save myself. 2 days that I spent more or less the same as the first. What else was I to do? I'd already exhausted all my limited resources, and no amount of kicking nor screaming was going to get me out of the trunk. I tried and failed at all that, multiple times. The simple fact of the matter was I did not have the tools to get out. Before I knew it, the second day came and went, and then I was on my third. It was at that point, the point at which the pinhole began to fade for the third time, that I knew I needed to confront the gun, figuring that at that point, I was as close to dead as one could be anyway. It wasn't a temptation anymore, it was an option. 3 options, actually. The handgun provided me with one of 3 outcomes. 1, it was loaded and I could use however many bullets I had to break the lock on the trunk. 2, it was loaded and I could choose to use the gun to find another less desirable but more convenient way out. Or 3, the gun was not loaded, and all the dwelling I'd been doing was completely and utterly pointless. As you know already, it wound up being the third. So, as the pinhole darkened at the end of my 3rd day in the trunk, I curled up and prepared mentally for my body to begin consuming itself, for my organs to start shutting down, and for finally my consciousness to slowly begin to dissolve away along with my brain. Oh, how easy that would have been to go slowly. Slowly but quickly in the grand scheme of things. I settled to wait for death to come, half expecting the reaper to come knocking on the metal. Maybe he'd be the one to let me out, I thought. With a jingle of keys and the pop of a trunk, he'd lead me to a pinhole light at the end of a tunnel. And so I waited, and I waited, and I waited. I waited a day, and then a week, 2 weeks, a month. Remember, these are all estimates, but after roughly 3 months had passed in the trunk, I noticed that not only was I still conscious, but the pinhole had also refused to relight. It never returned, not after it faded at the end of the 3rd day. After all the time that had passed, not the light nor my death seemed to come for me. The sun refused to rise, and I refused to rest. I could still feel my arms, my legs, that knot in my back that had begun to grow roots into the carpet. Despite it all, though, despite the hunger and the thirst and the time, I was still me. It wasn't until my 1st year in the trunk had passed that I figured I was immortal, that I couldn't die, or that more than likely I was already dead. Dead or experiencing some form of death anyway. And in between, this was when I feel I made my first shaking steps forward in the long crossover to the afterlife. This was when I truly began to settle in for the long ride. And this was when my mind first began to wander away from me. The main issue I faced after all the panic and the fear and the existential, or really post-existential dread, was how to fill the time. I was in a dark place with nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no one to talk to for years upon years. It was no wonder that I eventually lost my mind. Ironically, though, it was only after losing my mind, after I sat and stewed for a while in the nebulous state of existence I found myself in, that I reacquainted myself with my burial goods, my few things. Slowly, I began to see them in new ways, and my interest in them reignited. Without the light, and more importantly, without the constraint of time, they all took on new forms. Take the gum, for example. The gum was my first lesson in the pursuit of experience. Eating it was a tremendous mistake. I know that now. I know now that I would have probably gotten more use out of it, more time, more experience, if I'd used it as a sort of stress ball, squeezing it between my fingers, mashing it out for ages on and off. But unfortunately, I'd been starving for over a year at that point. I was a hungry man, and I did as hungry men do. I ripped the gum from the carpet and started to chew, slowly masticating it into oblivion. It lasted 5 years. The muscle memory, though, the repetitive, routine motion of chewing, of knocking my teeth together, lasted 6. In hindsight, had I resisted the urge to eat, had I used the gum instead as a plaything like dough or clay or some other vessel for stress release, it would have lasted much, much longer. I learned from my mistake, though, and moved on to the coins. I used them as I should have used the gum, although it was extremely tempting to chew on the coins too, to feel their coppery sting on my tongue, their tinny bite on the crowns of my teeth. I resisted the urge. Instead, I played it smart and I rubbed them. I pinched 2 of them between my index finger and my thumb, and I rubbed. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, I ground the coins together, listening to them scream against one another. They lasted much longer than the gum, but in due time they too disappeared. It was then that I realized that everything I touched would eventually degrade, evaporate in my hands in due time. My fingers like a stream eroding away riverbed stones. It wasn't a matter of if they would degrade. It was a matter of when. And that meant I couldn't just rely on physical sensation alone. I needed to learn to see again. After the coins, the gun entertained me for a good many years simply because it was something I could use to practice my new sight. Without light, I couldn't actually see the thing, but with enough time, touch, and disassembly, I could picture it in its entirety in my hands. I saw all of it at once, straight through every angle, every edge, every crisply machined cut, inside and out, innards and skin. I learned a lot from that gun. Mainly, though, I learned how to see without light, and I took that skill and moved on to the magazine. The nude magazine, I should clarify, not the magazine for the handgun. I'd already explored that magazine extensively. The magazine was both my greatest challenge and greatest experience. It took a few decades of careful touch and thorough inspection to learn to read in the dark, to differentiate the ink from the page, and all the colors from one another. Once I had learned, however, and once I'd read the magazine a couple thousand times, it opened up a world of possibilities. It was how I met the first of a long line of visitors. There was a woman about halfway through the magazine that I managed to help guide out of her prison of 2 dimensions. Even now, I do not know why she was the first I was able to make real. Maybe I had an affinity for her, maybe it was by random chance, or maybe she was just plain easy to read. But regardless of the why, one day she decided to make herself known. One day, she leapt from the print, my imagination drawing on the dark. She stepped defiantly out into the pitch and off of the page, splattering into reality like paint onto a fresh canvas. She was a supermodel from Texas named Montana, and I was fascinated with her voice, partly because sound was one of my least exercised senses, but mostly because her voice went over like the radio, like whiskey strained through fine gravel. It was scratchy and I itched. Initially, though, I had only taken to listening to her in hopes of getting lucky, though I have no idea how that would have worked because she was only about a foot tall. But the longer she talked, the more enthralled I became with her. She chose that name, Montana. She wasn't born with it as I'd initially assumed. Apparently, she chose it because firstly, it was a conversation starter, and secondly, Montana was a classic for strippers, which happened to be her previous profession before she got into modeling. "If it ain't broke," she said, and I couldn't agree more. It was only after we got past introductions that it finally registered to me how odd the whole situation was. Not the trunk, not my undeath, but the fact that I was talking to a 12-inch tall supermodel named Montana, and that even though I'd blinded myself long ago with the pin, I could still see her silhouette glowing in perfect technicolor. I blinded myself both out of boredom and the pursuit of reading better. It was too dark to see anyway, and I was already going off of touch alone to read the magazine. I felt that if I cut down on the vestigial, then my leftover mental faculties could be better used elsewhere. The neurons I'd used to see would instead be used to feel. Given enough time, I'm sure I could have brought Montana to life regardless of the loss of my eyes, but I was an impatient man, which was again, ironically, a terrible quality to have in my predicament. In hindsight, though, even if I had kept my eyes, I'm not entirely certain they would have worked anymore. It had been so long after all, that even if the trunk magically popped open somewhere along the way and I spilled back out into the world, much like Montana did into mine, I doubted my eyes would have even registered the change. Either the overload of sensation would have spurred an aneurysm and reduced me to a gaping idiot, or my mind would have simply refused to accept the information altogether. Either way, I'd come to terms with the reality that the trunk was all I had, that there was no going back. There's that, and the fact that I was already dead. So no, I didn't need my eyes. I spent a lifetime with Montana. She was a friend. I greatly appreciated her company. Over the years, she told me about her old life, and slowly we built a new one for her in the trunk. I'd flip back and forth through the magazine, tell her what was on the page, and anytime she heard something she liked, she'd drag it out of the print and into the trunk with us. Eventually, we'd furnish the entire trunk with the sofas and the chairs and the beds, and whatever else the other models on the other pages were lying on. We put up walls and laid out a floor. We even managed to bring back the light with decorative lamps and windows to let in the sun. Not the sun, but a sun nonetheless. For the longest time, we were both content with our existence. She'd lounge around on her sofas, and we'd talk the time away. Sometimes too, more often than not, we would spend the time silently. Her going about her motions, and me lying curled around my mental diorama like the world's largest and most deformed cat. My favorite time was always the morning. Every morning Montana would ask me how I was, and I'd tell her, "I'm well today. Always today, never tomorrow, and certainly never yesterday because of course there were no days anymore. There was only the now, and even then, after a millennium, I'm not entirely convinced a now exists within the confines of the trunk either." One particular day, though, Montana asked for a front door. After a little bit of waffling, I asked her why she'd want something as ridiculous as that, and she told me, because I want to go out. Then I asked her if she was going to come back, and she said, yes. I didn't believe her. I knew she was lying because I'd reasoned that she wasn't real. And if she wasn't real, that meant she had to have been coming from me. And if she was coming from me, that meant her thoughts were my thoughts. And if her thoughts were my thoughts, that meant I could read them. And so I read them and knew she was lying. Either way, I didn't blame her for wanting to go. We'd shared a life in that trunk together, and all things do have to come to an end, so I installed the door. She packed her things to go, but before she left, we decided to share one last dance. The room fell away along with the door, all except for a record player which started to spin a tune. She moved to the corner and began to waltz along to the song while I tossed her my bills. I wasn't being perverted. I was just trying to help her, to send her on her way with some money to spend wherever she wound up. Change for the ferryman, that kind of thing. Regardless, I have no idea where the bills went. Either they were swallowed up by the dark itself, or they slipped quietly between where the angles met in the corner, one of the two. On her way out, I decided to ask her a question. I thought that maybe by talking to myself in this extremely roundabout way that I could uncover some of the memories I'd lost from my time before the trunk. I asked her, "Who am I, really?" She thought long and hard about the question, then answered, "Not a good man, but not a bad one either." Only half satisfied with the answer, I asked her, "Okay, and who are you, really?" "Why, I'm you." "Yes, I know that. I was hoping you'd be a little more specific." She cocked her head. "Well, actually, I misspoke. I was you." I knew what she meant. She was trying to suggest that she was one of my past lives. I appreciated the attempt to legitimize our life together, to insist that she was in fact different than me even if we were the same, but I didn't buy it. I didn't buy that I was tapping into my soul's ancestral memory, because then that would mean I was not only once a stripper named Montana, but also probably an Egyptian pharaoh considering how much I talked about them. Two problems with that. I hate the pyramids, and I would not willingly name myself Montana. In the end, I simply smiled and told her, "To each their own, then." And with that, finally, Montana took a bow and stepped between the cracks in the corner of the trunk. And just like that, she was gone and I was alone again. I did try, briefly, for about a couple hundred years, to bring others from the magazine to life. I ripped them sometimes willingly, sometimes forcefully from the pages of the magazine, and over time they built a small world. They started the same as Montana did, drawing from the contents of the magazine, extracting materials from the various backdrops like furniture and trees and brick and mortar. They started with a simple room, then that room became a house, then a neighborhood, then a suburb, then an entire city. Before long, it was a well-oiled utopia. Since their only frame of reference for construction were carefully designed interior sets, thoughtfully framed shots of skylines, and meticulously scouted natural locations, the whole of the world felt so very designed. It was beautiful, really, an architect's wet dream, a city of supermodels shaded by a lumpy, malnourished mountain range, picturesque in the most literal sense of the word. I destroyed it. Even after everything they built, it didn't evoke the same feelings I had experienced with Montana. So one day I blinked and the city was gone. It was then that I gave up on the magazine entirely to instead turn inward. Having expended my burial goods completely and exhausted all experience I from them, I entered a long hibernation. It was a sleepless dream. I curled up in utero and let time crash over me in breaking waves. It was relentless, but like an age-old stone on an age-old shore, I learned to ignore the insistence, the incessance of time. With time, my skeleton solidified. With time, my body calcified. I spent countless ages completely motionless in both mind and body. A pebble adrift in the void, I was convinced that this would be the remainder my fate because it did make sense. We enter this life ripped from the dark, and after we're done, we return to it. To the void we come and go, because what is this trunk really but a womb to curl up in and wait? There was a time, however, sometime not too long ago, a time anywhere between 50 and 500,000 years ago, where I felt a shift. Something had changed, and so, For the first time in oh so long, I unfurled myself from my ball and felt my toes prod an inch further into the dark. The trunk, it seemed, had gotten bigger. First, I thought it was absurd. I figured that it had been so long, so very, very long, that I'd just forgotten the dimensions of the trunk. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew because my dimensions were all I had left. They were my only reminder of my existence because they were the aspect of myself that the trunk reminded me of the most. Every shift, every twitch, every stretch in vain would remind me of the fact that I was a tall man stuck in a trunk the size of a small man. My suspicions were confirmed when the next day I unfurled myself once more and found that I could stretch another inch into the dark, the next day 3, the next 4, until finally, for the first time in God knows how long, I was able to lie flat on my back, and it was divine. The process continued on like that until eventually I could stand, I could walk around, I could jog from end to end of the trunk, but with time that jog became longer and longer. The trunk was running away from me. Its walls disappeared into the void, faster than I could possibly hope to chase them, further than I could possibly hope to catch them. Even the carpet, the ground beneath my feet, began to feel less tangible by the moment, fizzling out beneath the soles of my feet into non-existence. The trunk itself was abandoning me, and with it, it devoured my body. At some point, after drifting in the ether for long enough, I recognized I wasn't one singular thing anymore. My mind had long since expanded past its physical boundaries, long since oozed from the folds of my brain to fill the trunk. My being like water from a sponge leaking out onto an empty countertop. I left myself somewhere along the way to rot in a shag carpet grave. All at once I could feel every inch of the trunk, every nook, every cranny. I was the trunk and the trunk was me, and so I began to scratch my words like constellations into the walls, tattoos into my skin. My final message before opening my door, before squeezing through my pinhole: burn, 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 do not go slowly. Breaking the rule of 2 when it comes to outdoor adventures, I ventured deeper into the woods located somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I won't go into detail on the exact location, just know that this place shouldn't be explored. Luckily, I did see some nearby campers along my way, so I wasn't completely alone. Anyway, while I was venturing, I stumbled upon a cave I could see from off the side of the trail. Gazing at it, I noticed an old beat trail heading towards it. I glanced at my watch to see if I had enough time to explore it before the sunset. Estimating, I guessed I had a good 2 hours until then. I soaked up the lowering rays of the afternoon sun, feeling overjoyed until I didn't. Walking off the trail towards the cave, something felt off. The birds didn't seem to chirp as cheerfully, and the happiness that had filled me withered away, being replaced with unease. Like a dark pit of dread gathering from the back of my throat to the bottom of my stomach. However, being a fear junkie, I pressed on as it filled me with curiosity, and yeah, I probably would be the first to die in a horror movie. Anyway, doing so gave me some type of dumb ego boost, as if I was brave. What I would encounter would wipe that all away, and the dark pit in my stomach would spread to every inch of my frame. I finally reached the entrance of the cave, and I noticed graffiti covering the outside of it, while the cave itself was blocked by an iron gate. It must have been some old mine of some sort that the Forest Service blocked off for safety, which wasn't uncommon for this area, which is not too far from an old repurposed mining town. Some teens must have tagged it at some point. None of the graffiti was very interesting, but being tired from the hike, I sat on a small rock nearby while leaning my back on the side of the cave entrance. A stone-cold shiver snuck up my spine, causing me to lean forward and glance back. It had felt like someone shoved snow down his shirt, but it was dry, and the wall was nothing special. The eerie feeling grew even more to the point my bravery wore off. So I stood up and was about to head out when I saw some carved words into the stone that had been covered by some graffiti, making them hard to make out. Squinting my eyes, I read, "Leave before it follows you." A sound clatter echoed from the cave. My eyes shot towards it, seeing nothing but the dark abyss behind the iron bars. I verbally said, "Nope," while turning my back to the cave and walking away. That's when the iron bars behind me squeaked and I turned around to see an animal behind the gate. I stood in utter confusion, wondering how on earth a deer was able to get back there. Maybe there's another entrance, I thought to myself. Intrigued, I walked back towards the cave. While doing so, the deer just stood there watching me, but as I got closer, the smell that came with it was atrocious to the point I was holding back the contents of my stomach with all I had. This stopped me in my tracks, as well as the dark pit inside hitting its max, causing my legs to quiver. The words from the carved message replayed inside of my head. Leave before it follows you. Swiftly, I began to turn around when the deer's head snapped sideways as it opened its jaw to a horrid length. Biting the iron bars, it shook like an old blender. In fear, I watched, too paralyzed to even move, as the deer then began to slam its body in between the gaps of the iron bars. I could hear the bones popping and twisting as it began to push its way through. The setting sun reflected off the matted hair of the deer, disheveled and dirty. I knew I had to run, but I felt stuck in place out of fear or by something else. Stuck just gazing upon this horrid sight. That's when I noticed, as the deer's hooves passed the bars, they began to morph into a humanoid hand with slender fingers. Screeching accompanied the cracking noises. Upon sight, I figured it was a skinwalker. This was more than enough for me to gather my strength to move my legs and run out of there. I ran down from where the cave stood, and I could see the main trail in sight. Sadly, I also noticed the sun being covered by the surrounding mountains, and in less than half an hour I would be in complete darkness with that thing. Screeches followed behind me, only growing louder by the moment, as if the thing had broken free from the cave. My back foot kicked a rock which went directly under my front one, spraining my ankle and slamming my torso and chest into the dirt below. Throwing up out of fear and pain, I glanced behind me to see the cold reflection of the rising moon bouncing off the humanoid creature, who was on all fours running directly at me. Scrambling to my feet, I carried on running away, thinking these were my last moments, and my life flashed before my eyes. That's when I remembered the campers who I had passed on the way up. They were my only hope, as I couldn't outrun this thing for long. I quickened my pace and eagerness as a glimpse of hope shone through the fear and pain. Their campfire flashed off of the pine trees in the distance. Help! I screamed, trying to get the campers' attention to see if the group of people would scare the beast off. Getting closer, I ran into their campsite, dirty, panting, and in pain. There were about 4 older guys who all stood there confused and in shock at the sight I posed in front of them, trying to gather the air to tell them what was happening. One of the men pulled out a pistol, aiming it at me. I held up my hands as I thought he was going to shoot. That's when I heard a round fire coming from it and fully expecting it to hit me. I felt some relief knowing that I wouldn't die by whatever was chasing me. However, the bullet flew past me, and before I could react, the humanoid thing pounced from behind me onto the man who held the gun. He must have hit it as blood squirted onto my face as it flew by. All the men began trying to save their friend with whatever they could, with even one using a hot metal s'more stick that was being cleaned off in the fire to pierce a hole into the side of it. The beast let out a horrid sound before biting the neck of the man and ripping it off. Knowing there was nothing I could do to help, I booked it back to the main trail, feeling bad for leading it to them. All I was hoping is that I left soon enough now before it could follow me. The sun by now was completely gone, and I was running with only the light of the moon to light my way. Behind me I could hear the silenced screams of the men, which led to a dreadful silence. My only hope was that it forgot about me, but my optimism never seemed to pan out usually. My red car shined like dark blood in the lighting. Scrambling my hands through my pocket, I grabbed the keys and clicked the unlock button. However, I forgot the light would turn on. Behind me, I could hear the thing roar as it seemed to be attracted to the light. Realizing how dumb I was, I ran and jumped inside my car. And with the engine roaring, I took off without looking back at all, as I didn't need any more fuel for my nightmares. I immediately drove to the nearest police department and told them of what had taken place. And they didn't believe me at first and seemed to laugh it off as some type of sick prank. However, As they examined the blood on my clothes a little more closely, they noticed it didn't look fake. They asked me to lead them to where it happened, and I refused. No way I was going to go anywhere near that place ever again. I told them where it was located, and they had me stay at the police station for the time being as I received some medical attention. Afterwards, I ended up falling asleep, waking up to two people who looked like they were in between being park rangers and federal agents. That was some bear attack, wasn't it? Do you have any serious injuries? One of them asked. That wasn't a bear attack. It was some type of humanoid deer. I screamed. We already tracked and put the bear down for your information. You didn't happen to personally know those other campers out there? We saw you mentioned in the report there were 4 of them, which is strange as we only found 2 bodies. Then what was left of them after being mauled by the bear wasn't enough to properly ID them. We're still working on running the plates on the truck that we assume belonged to them. Also, the bodies showed patterns of being mauled by a bear. You must have fallen and hit your head so hard that it jumbled up your memory, the other replied. No, I wish that I had. I remember everything. So don't you dare try to gaslight me on this. Whatever you say, you'll see the full information of what we found on the news in a day or 2 if you're more likely to believe that. I wish we could stay and chat more, but there are some reporters that need to be attended to, one said as they proceeded to walk away. Confused and in pain, I sat there wondering what they meant by it being a bear attack. There's no way the evidence could have pointed to a bear attack. I must seem crazy to them, but they got it all wrong. There wasn't much left I could do, and I was allowed to leave the police station, so I went home. I waited for the news to come and interview me for my side of the story for the quote, bear attack, but they never did. Then the news story finally broke and it read, for men killed tragically in camping accident and bear attack. I thought to myself that at least they got the number of people correct, but as I continued to read it, it said that 2 men died while exploring a closed-off mine, saying they had broken in and some boulders came down on top of them. This wasn't right at all, I thought to myself. Those guys were nowhere near the cave when that thing attacked, unless it must have dragged them there. I wanted to find a way to see the bodies for myself to prove to myself I wasn't crazy, but they were cremated before anyone who wasn't an official could get near them. Now I just sound like a crazy person when I tell the story, but just know this. Just because the news reports that someone drowned in a lake or got lost while hiking doesn't make it true or unaltered. Could be true or a cover-up, as the best lies are sprinkled with truths. At least I'm able to get this off of my chest. But those words will always run through my head. Leave before it follows you. Okay, so a little backstory here. My husband and I have this really shitty bed frame. It's basically 2 twin prison cots zip-tied together. We have this stupid thing because we got bed bugs about a year ago, which is its own horror story, the moral of which is, pay for an exterminator. Anyway, we had to throw away our nice bed, and because of the cost of everything we ended up with these hollow metal cot bases. We have 2 dogs, Hester, named after our high school's football coach, and Molly, which was her name when we rescued her. It fit, so it stuck. Hester likes to sleep directly on top of you, whereas Molly is most likely to be found under the bed or in another room if possible. She kinda has 13-year-old girl energy. Sometimes she will lay in our bed before we get in bed, but as soon as we even bump her, she's done and back under she'll go. I think she likes her little cave. So last Wednesday was pretty normal. We all headed to bed and Molly hustled under the bed, despite me begging her to come cuddle me. After I gave up patting the bed and calling her name, I fell asleep around 10:30 reading a spooky story on here. Around 12 a.m., I woke up to Molly growling, which is unusual because she never growls and rarely barks. I asked her what was wrong, and once she heard my voice, she calmed down and I didn't hear her growling anymore. Me, being paranoid because of the story I just read, made my husband go check the house, to which he lightly protested because Hess hadn't been barking or growling, which he does to everything including our poor male lady. He nonetheless relented and checked the other rooms. No murderers in the building. Molly was just dreaming. Go back to sleep. I felt better, but it was weird and I wanted to make sure Molly was okay. So I leaned upside down under the bed to check on Molly. I saw what I thought was her fluffy tail wagging, and said, "Are you okay, Molly girl?" I just saw her wag her tail, so I took that as a yes and popped back up and went to bed. But knowing what I know now, I don't think it was Molly. The next day, Thursday, was uneventful. The most exciting thing I did was attend a vendor lunch at work, but everything else at home was boring and normal. Dinner, TV, shower, bed. Same as the night before, we all headed to bed, only this time I fell right asleep because I was so tired from a bad night's sleep the night before. Then at 12 a.m. it happened again. Molly growled, only this time she barked too, which is actually what woke us all up. Even Hester started barking. I was so startled that I just yelled, "Dogs! Cut it out!" which stopped Molly, but now Hester was all riled up and jumped down to check on his sister. I followed his lead and I peeked under the bed again. This time I saw what the night before I thought was Molly's tail, except Molly was on the other side of the bed, wagging her tail so I could tell it wasn't her. I popped up and grabbed my phone for better light, but when I looked back, all I saw was a notebook, some dirty socks, every hair tie I've ever lost, and Molly just wagging her tail at me. When I told my husband, he jokingly said it's probably a ghost and told me to go back to bed. But I was still freaked, mostly from how jarring it is to wake up from a dead sleep to two barking dogs. So I stayed up and just tried to calm down. Molly decided that she would spend some time on top of the bed, which is kind of weird, but I knew as long as I didn't invade her personal space, she would stay, so I made some extra room. I was messing around on my phone when I heard the faintest rustling and what sounded like a door moving. I froze, and I don't think I've ever been so scared. I could see Molly, I was touching Hester, and my husband was out cold, so nothing else should have been making noise. Certainly nothing should have been opening doors. It just sounded like the faintest noise of something scooting. I whispered, "Molly." Then it just stopped. I still couldn't move, so I held my breath and just listened. Silence. Finally, around 2:30, I was able to calm down enough to sleep, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I didn't have to work because I only work every other Friday, which was great because I was exhausted. It was a pretty lazy day. I decided I wanted a little nap, so I let the dogs outside to play since it was so nice and walked to our bedroom for a little snooze. At 12 p.m. this time, I heard Molly barking and growling under the bed again, which was impossible because I knew she was outside. And this time I felt it bump the bed. I immediately started crying because I was home alone and all I could imagine was a literal monster under my bed. As soon as it heard me sobbing, it quieted down and the sounds stopped. I gathered enough courage to leap out of bed, as far from the bed as I could get, and sprinted outside. I called my husband at work and explained what happened. While he was compassionate, he's also about as pragmatic as one can be, so he told me I was probably just tired and heard the dogs from outside. I reluctantly agreed and decided to let the dogs in and nap on the couch. Friday nights for us is usually 2 bottles of wine and binge watching It's Always Sunny until we are good and tipsy enough to playfully debate stupid things. Last Friday was no exception. I think we argued about whether or not blackout curtains canceled noise or not, which turned into why our dogs would be barking at nothing the last couple of nights. I told my husband that I kind of believed we had a ghost, and he teased I was being dramatic. Due to the wine overconsumption, I was feeling a little sensitive, and I took it way more personally than I would have sober, so I pouted and said I didn't want to sleep with him, which really only proves him right about the drama, but I stood my drunk, sensitive ground and fell asleep on the couch. About 20 minutes later, I'm woken up by barking and my husband yelling, "Molly, stop it. What is going on?" Only this time I wasn't in there to prove it wasn't Molly, so I ran into our bedroom to check on everyone. Molly was still growling, so I lifted the bed skirt to call Molly out. But the next thing I hear is Molly's nails clicking on the hardwood behind me, and that's when I realized Molly had been under the coffee table when I bolted out of the living room. It hadn't fully registered until I saw her behind me and not under the bed. But IT was under the bed. At first I thought it was a dog because of all the hair I saw. However, when it turned toward me, I saw it looked more human, but it was growling exactly like Molly. I gasped and scrambled back, but it flinched and whimpered like I had heard it. Then it slowly scooted away and disappeared. After that, I told my husband to grab the dog's leashes. We were going to a hotel, or at the very least I was. since he saw Molly follow me into the room after thinking he heard her under the bed. He agreed at the very least something was weird. I had to pay the Uber driver $20 to let us bring the dogs despite noticing a substantial bit of cat hair. But I didn't give a fuck, I just wanted out. When we got to the hotel, I told the front desk agent, half joking, that we were running away from home, which she didn't find humorous and just dryly handed us the key. We clambered up to our hotel room. Luckily, we had enough points to pay for the night and didn't have to fight about how much the hotel was. And both of us, drunk and exhausted, passed out. We made it through the night without incident, except Molly was sleeping in the bed now. I guess she was rattled too. The next morning, after a nice hotel shower and bad hotel coffee, I told my husband we needed to dismantle the bed and figure out what was going on. I said if I was going to sleep in that room again, the bed frame either needed to be boarded up or we had to just put the damn bed directly on the floor. I don't think my husband was completely sold at this point, but he did have to admit that Molly was acting weird at night, and last night did confuse him. So when we got home, we started to pack our bed up. We settled on just laying it on the ground until we could afford a bed frame with drawers. Poor Molly, no more bed cave. As we went to pull the mattress off, the dog started to lose it and scrambled to get under the bed now that there was more room. Once I could see what they saw, I dropped my side of the mattress. Luckily, my husband wasn't looking under the bed and was able to catch it exclaiming, "What the hell, ally, you almost crushed the dogs." With tears welling in my eyes, I stared at the floor under our bed. There was a small, roughly cut slab of our floor, presumably leading to the crawl space. Once I finally stammered out, "I'm not crazy," my husband saw what I saw. "Holy shit, Molly, Hess, get away from there now." He said, "Come on, everyone out of the house." My husband ushered us all out to the front porch and immediately called 911. The cops came and spent a frustrating amount of time asking us if we were sure this isn't just your crawl space access, to which we kept explaining over and over again that it wasn't there when we moved in and pointing out it didn't have a hinge, saying that the crawl space was most likely to have a possum or raccoon. They called animal control and told us this wasn't really a police matter. I was so angry because I don't know of any raccoons who can effectively cut a square door in my floor, but I didn't really have any other choice. So, Jerry, our friendly neighborhood exterminator/relocator, arrived with his cages and possum catching stick thing. We explained to him we felt very confident it wasn't an animal. But since he was contacted by the police and they assured him we were being dramatic, he decided to go in. We waited and waited for him to come out, praying he had a possum in his stupid fucking cage. But after about 20 minutes of complete silence, we started to worry. We yelled down the hole, "Hey Jerry, everything okay down there?" Silence. Shocking silence. Even the dogs seemed still, heads cocked, like they were listening for something. Anything. With nowhere else to turn, we called the police again and explained what had happened. They just told us they would call his company and send someone else out. But like what? A man fully went missing in our crawl space? So here comes Jerry's boss. We explained everything again and begged him not to go in the crawl space, to which he said, "I'm not. That's not really my job." He walked around the house to look for other exits to the crawl space, and when he found an open hatch, told us. Jerry is our most tenured relocation expert, but he has a tendency to be a little antisocial. He probably didn't find anything, decided the job was done, and left. That didn't exactly feel like an answer to us, but this guy knows Jerry, and we don't, so like, whatever, I guess. But also, what am I going to do? Make him go look for Jerry? So he just left. It wasn't until about an hour after he left that we realized Jerry's van was still parked on our street. So I felt pretty confident that Jerry didn't just leave the crawl space, unless he decided to hitchhike with his possum stick. But at this point it was like 9:30 p.m. and we were so tired and felt like we were out of options and, unfortunately, hotel points. We decided to sleep in the guest room with the door locked and barricaded, per my theatric, but frankly practical recommendation. The floor in this room is built directly on the slab, since it's a converted garage. We called for Jerry one more time, but decided to put the mattress back on the floor, We figured if he was still under there, he could get out of the hatch, and I didn't want a stranger crawling into my house in the middle of the night. We decided that either Jerry must be weirdo who actually just wandered off, or the ghost ate him. That's only partially a joke at this point. We made it through the next couple nights, no Jerry, but also no incidents. I guess his van just lives here now because I can't get a hold of anybody at his company. I don't really have any other option but to keep trying to call them and wait. It's not like the police have helped at all. But now it's Monday night at 12 a.m. Molly is nuzzled under my neck, Hester is at my feet, and we cannot sleep because now we can hear them both growling under the bed. I needed to go for a walk that day. It didn't matter that I had been exhausted the day before. It didn't matter that I was supposed to have one of my friends over in a matter of hours. I needed to go on a walk that day. Lincoln Avenue. Just 2 words. That's all I could remember thinking. Lincoln Avenue. A completely random, inconsequential street name that I'm sure you could find in almost any state across the country. But when I woke up that morning, I couldn't think of anything but that one name. Lincoln Avenue. Like always, part of me just wanted to ignore it. To ignore the name and the voice that, for the moment, gently whispered it to me as though the voice was speaking from within my mind. If it was just for my sake, I would have, please believe me when I say that. It wasn't just for my sake, though. My dad had been in the hospital 2 weeks prior for a head injury. I could still remember the call I'd gotten from my sister when it happened. Dude, you need to get to Flower Hospital now. Why? Finally decided to get that stick out of your dash. Just shut up and listen. Dad fell and hit his head. He must have been working on the roof or something. What? I thought he was getting some contractors to work on that. Well, apparently not Dan. Get to the hospital now. They're taking him to the emergency room now. If past events were any indication, my dad's life depended entirely on what I did within the next 24 hours. I'd be lying if I said that he and I had the closest relationship even before the incident, let alone in the last 5 years since I'd moved out. I was sure in some way he still resented me for leaving, just as much as I still partly resented him for shutting down. Aside from the past few months, we'd barely even made any effort to repair our friendship, let alone what could be called a father-son relationship. But he was the only parent I had left, and we were finally starting to love each other again. I needed him. More than that, Kathy needed him. They'd been each other's rocks after everything happened, and I knew how badly it had affected all of us when Mom died. I couldn't afford to let myself or Kathy go through that again. On any other day, the weather outside would have been idyllic. I guess it still was. Blue skies, a breeze just gentle enough to keep me cool while the sun hung high above. Only a few small clouds peppering the expanse of blue, and a few birds singing their songs. It felt almost insulting, considering what was about to happen. As I took my first steps and passed the borders of my yard, I heard all the confirmation I needed to know that I was beyond the point of no return. The voice was whispering the street again. Lincoln Avenue. I had already walked about a mile when my phone began ringing again. Even without looking, I could almost guarantee that it was going to be Kathy again, calling for the 100th time to give me some update to Dad's condition. I didn't bother answering. I was in no mood to hear that things hadn't gotten any better, or worse, that he had gone fully unresponsive. The clock was already ticking. Seeing how fast it was winding down wouldn't change that. It wasn't a simple straight shot. At certain intervals I would hear the voice calling out again, instructing me to go left or right, down paths I had driven past countless times, routes that I could drive in minutes or less, now passing by uncomfortably slowly. Right, left, right, straight. Before I'd even realized it, an hour had passed, and I was trekking on the side of busy street. Restaurants, stores, and gas stations littered either side of the road. Cars whizzed past me as the sidewalk became wider, and I was no longer the only pedestrian walking along it. Some walked dogs, others jogged, and others still casually walked along as they remained glued to their phones. None paid any mind to me. Out of sheer habit, I pulled my own phone out and checked my Steps app to see just how far I had gone. According to it, I had traveled only a little more than 3 miles. 3 miles, a little over an hour of walking. I wondered just how much further I had to go. As it turned out, it wasn't much farther at all. I had been carefully checking each street sign I passed on my forced pilgrimage, hoping each time that the one I passed would be my ever-so-sought Lincoln Avenue. 2 hours in, I finally found it. Just past an old apartment complex. The small green sign said in partially chopped lettering, Lincoln Avenue. My chest tightened as I read the name aloud. Doubts began to creep into my mind as I clenched my fist. Was I really doing this again? What if I was wrong? Maybe I was just going through some kind of waking nightmare, hearing things that weren't there. Lord knows, I hadn't been getting much sleep in the last few weeks. I remembered reading in a medical report somewhere that the human mind begins to break down even after just 24 hours of not getting any sleep, and that there was potential of both visual and auditory hallucinations after 48. The same report claimed that while you could theoretically survive on just 4 hours of sleep for every 24, you could still feel the negative effects of sleep deprivation over an extended time. Maybe that included the aforementioned hallucinations? I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept more than 5 hours after Dad was admitted. Maybe that's all this was? 209 Lincoln Avenue. Red roses. The voice was back, and the illusion was shattered. I could justify hearing a random street like before. The name had to be common. This, however, was specific. An exact address, and based on the sound of it, something to identify the specific house I needed to go to. I still wanted to believe that this was just a bunch of hallucinations. I really did. But I could still remember the times I had done this before, what had happened the one time I refused. I could see Mom. Shattered. The street was just like any other you'd drive by on the way to something actually significant. Rows upon rows of houses, a few small intersections marking the various blocks, a mix of trimmed and not so trimmed grass, and the occasional tree in the front yard. The sky was blue, plenty of clouds. I could hear unseen birds singing their songs as what normally would be an idyllic, practically picturesque day moved along undisturbed. If I hadn't known any better, I may have stopped to enjoy a walk through the neighborhood. As it was, I couldn't enjoy my time here. I had work to do, and I just wanted it over with. To any unsuspecting eyes, which was realistically all of them, there was nothing interesting to see about me. A stranger passing by, maybe out getting some exercise in. Ideally, I would be so unremarkable that whoever lived here wouldn't even realize I had crossed paths with them. I would be just another nameless and blurry face, too unclear to even remember right. I would need that indifference. Each house I passed was mostly the same. Simple 1 to 2 stories, a side driveway that fit multiple cars, and some variation of flowers. The neighborhood didn't look high-end, but it wasn't struggling either. Most of the houses had some variation of one person mowing their lawns or otherwise doing yard work, or children running and playing while adults looked on. I felt the guilt of what was happening well up in me as some of the adults raised their hands in polite courtesy waves. Waves I had to fight myself to return. This was supposed to be a safe space, a place where families could enjoy their time together. And here I was, prowling like a lion seeking to tear it all apart. I'd long stopped trying to separate myself from the voice's consequences. There was no point to it. I may have abhorred the choices I made and what they would lead to, but I made them regardless. All I could do was tell myself that my father was worth what was coming, that my sister was worth it because I knew I wasn't. One by one, I passed the houses, watching the numbers, noting the flowers. 199 pink lilies, 201 blue hydrangeas, 203 white orchids, 205 red spider lilies, 207 black roses. 209 Lincoln Avenue was like many of the houses I had passed. Well kept, in good repair, a flower bed neatly tended to, red roses vibrant and almost seeming to sparkle in the sunlight. At the end of the street was a set of guardrails blocking off a small set of woods, just small enough that I could see through the cracks to an open field. My heart felt heavy enough to sink into my shoes as I observed the house. It had been freshly painted, a chalk drawing of two large stick figures and a third. Smaller one smiled brightly in the driveway. What was I doing? I couldn't do this. I had to do this. Couldn't do this. I had to do this. Hey, buddy, can I help you? This voice wasn't in my head. It was right to the side of me. A man's voice. Turning to look at the man, I came face to face with a well-kept man in his mid-30s, maybe 10 years older than myself. He had short, neatly trimmed black hair with an equally maintained beard. He wore a plain, featureless white shirt and was carrying what looked to be a bag of groceries. Restaurant. Do it. The voice half instructed, half demanded. Its tone was different this time. Gone was the whisper, and in its place was an almost childlike eagerness. I recognized the tone immediately, and my stomach churned. Hey, I replied, feigning a confused expression as I looked from the house back to the man, a mix of impatience and frustration on his face. I think I got turned around somewhere. I'm looking for that new steakhouse that was moved in a few weeks ago. I lied. Immediately, the man's expression softened, and he even chuckled to himself as he shook his head. Lincoln's Steakhouse? He asked. I nodded. Yeah, you're not the first to have wound up here. You got a phone on you? He asked, despite every bone in my body telling me to stop, to turn and run. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the GPS app, and handed it to the man. I watched as the man punched in some unknown address into my phone with his free hand, resisting every urge to snatch it away. I could practically hear the voice salivating in anticipation as the man handed my phone back to me. There you go, man. Should be good to go now. I faked a laugh as I rubbed the back of my head. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to intrude or anything. The man shook his head and waved the apology aside. You're like the third guy that's happened to this month. Not a big deal. His guard was down, I could tell by his tone. It was now or never. Dan, I said, introducing myself as I extended my hand. I prayed my hands weren't sweating, that my heart, beating like the stampede of 1,000 frightened animals, would hold out for just a few minutes longer, that my breath would not betray the anxiety in my soul. The man glanced with seeming amusement at my hand, then, with a tired sigh, took it. Chuck, he offered kindly, shaking my hand. Chuck, my father's name. Of course, I thought. For a moment, I wondered when he had become a father, if he too had an elder son, maybe a daughter on the way. How closely did his family mirror my own? I would never get the answers to those questions, not that I deserved them anyway. As I released Chuck's hand, a pressure released in my head, like a congestion clearing after days of thickness. The voice was silent, gone. It was finished. I hope you have a good rest of your day, I offered sheepishly. It was the first true thing I told Chuck since I'd met him, save my name. Chuck merely gave a polite wave of the hand, then marched up his sidewalk and towards his door. I did not watch him enter. I did not linger to see what would happen. The walk home felt longer, more exhausting. A rational mind would have said it was due to how far I had already walked. A guilty one would say it was the shame of falling back into a hated habit, one I'd tried time and time again to shake ever since that voice had become bound to me in that stupid childhood game so many years ago. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, a mix of both physical and mental exhaustion. The sudden emptiness from the loss of the voice probably didn't help. For a moment, I hoped beyond practicality that the voice would stay gone this time, that Chuck would be its final victim, that just maybe this time it would be satiated. I didn't want the temptation anymore, or the fear of losing anyone else. I knew that's all it was though, just a hope. The voice always came back. Surely enough, just as I got home and opened my door, I felt a familiar, crippling weight seep into my head. I hurried and slammed the door closed and pinned my back against it, both ready and not ready for what came next. All around me I heard a sickening crunching, ripping, and snapping. Phantom pains would flare in my own limbs for moments at a time, but never long enough to truly understand what he was going through. The voice moaned happily as it enjoyed its meal, either oblivious to my awareness or indifferent to it. I pictured Chuck playing with a little boy I had never seen, a wife I would never know. Tears welled in my eyes as I heard a series of pops, followed by a giddy laughter and more moaning. Even now, I find myself hoping Chuck and all of my victims were already dead whenever this was happening. I could barely stand their fate as it was. To know they were alive during all this, that mom was alive during it, I just couldn't handle it. I'm not sure how long I stayed there, curled by the door, rocking myself gently back and forth. Even after the noises stopped, I couldn't bring myself to move. Long after the light of day had stopped pouring into my home, leaving me shrouded in darkness, I was still there. I suppose I must have gotten up at some point, because the next thing I remembered was waking up in my own bed, window blinds open, still dark outside. Had I fallen asleep, or simply been so out of it that I hadn't remembered going to the bedroom? A familiar ringtone snapped me out of my head. I looked beside my bed to the nightstand, my phone lighting up with Kathy's name identifying her as the caller. Though I suspected I already knew what the call was about, I answered anyway. I did the best I could to feign surprise as she told me Dad was making a recovery, that he was lucid. Just like always, the voice had kept its end of the deal. Just like I feared it would. Just like I knew it would. After a few more minutes of conversation, I wished Kathy a good night. Another brief moment of sincerity. I wanted to be happy my father was alive, that Kathy would get to have him in her life for a while longer, that I would get the chance to fully reconcile our relationship, that we could be a family again. But the happiness was a shallow one, a drop in the proverbial hole that I hadn't stopped digging 14 years ago. How many bodies were in that hole now, I wondered. I desperately wanted to sleep. In my dreams, I could forget what had happened, be blissfully unaware of everything if even for a few hours. Instead, I went to the internet, lying on my back as I searched for my most local news station. I wasn't sure why I was doing this. I already knew what I'd find. Maybe it was my own form of penance, my own way of forcing myself to acknowledge what I had really done. As the page loaded, I saw it. The top story: local man found eviscerated in his home. Suspect currently unknown. I don't remember my mother ever being sane. From the very moment I was born, the house I lived in was filled with her madness. The tattered curtains that were never washed, the constantly running TV with all sorts of religious broadcasts, the silence that followed her nightly sobbing. But most of all, I was terrified of the icon of the Virgin Mary cracked in places, and I swear, I felt her watching me. My mother always smelled of alcohol, from early morning till late at night. I never saw my father, and whenever I asked about him, she answered with absolute certainty that my father was an angel. Not in the sense of being a good man, but literally a real angel. She said it with wide open, yet utterly empty and lifeless eyes. A cigarette dangled from her cracked lips as she repeated, "Your father is an angel, Michael. A real angel." I believed her maybe when I was 5. I was happy and rushed to tell my friends who my father was. The reaction was predictable. They mocked me and teased me for years. No matter how many times my mother repeated her story about my father, no matter how many religious channels she made me watch, I stopped believing her. In my teenage years, it got worse. I was hot-tempered, stubborn, and had a terrible relationship with my mother. I openly called her crazy and begged her to tell me the truth about my father. But instead, in one of her drunken episodes, she screamed that my father was an angel, holding a cracked rosary in her hand as if she could summon him from the heavens. He burned with light when he came to me. And you? She would grab my face roughly, scratching my cheeks and chin with her nails. You carry his sacred blood. Eventually, I stopped listening to her at all, let alone speaking to her. At 18, I moved to another city and fulfilled my dream. To escape the rotting house with its perpetually yellow lighting and peeling walls, and my deranged mother. Because of her, people called me crazy, mocked me about my father, and openly insulted her, which often got me into fights. My only fond memory with her is of a day we went to the beach. She held my hand, and we simply watched the sea. Everything was fine until she looked up at the sky and said, "When will you come, my love?" After moving out, I worked hard, made new friends, real good friends. Whenever they asked about my family, I said I was an orphan. I even started drinking a little just to understand her, but not become her. I should note that I was a firm atheist, unlike my mother's fanatical religiosity. But I'm not writing to tell you how I ran away from home and my insane mother. I'm writing to tell you how I came back. After I moved out, I felt something watching me. I chalked it up to stress. Even went to a psychologist, but that strange feeling never left, like something was protecting me. Once, a car nearly hit me, but I managed to jump away just in time. Another time, I stopped walking without knowing why, and a second later, a massive branch fell from a tree that could have easily crushed my skull. One night, she left me 11 voice messages. Some were just sobs that turned into screams, others were drunken mumblings. But the last message, sent half an hour after the others, made my skin crawl. My mother's voice was low and barely audible, as if she were hiding somewhere. "He's coming for you. Your father, he came specifically for you." I couldn't take my eyes off the phone, couldn't even move. I had cut off all contact with her for a year. Maybe 2, I lost count. The next morning, I got a call from the hospital. They said my mother had been admitted to the psychiatric ward, and I barely held back laughter. Not because it was funny, it wasn't, but because it was inevitable. The nurse who called said, "We need you to come and collect her things." At the house, we found something strange. Very reluctantly, I returned to that same house, still reeking of damp wood and despair, just like before. Her belongings were packed into a clear plastic container. There were old photographs where she was still young and beautiful, smiling sincerely. A smile I never saw on her again. There were other items, but 2 stood out to me. A worn, large journal and a massive black feather, thick and strange. She had kept both on a little shelf above her bed. Besides that, the walls of her room were covered with bizarre symbols, written in chalk and ash. But most striking of all was a figure with wings and outstretched arms, apparently drawn in blood. I never saw any of this as a child. My knees trembled when the nurse told me that all the symbols and the figure had been hidden behind furniture and posters. I barely managed to sleep and woke up from the cold. The window was open, though I clearly remembered closing all the windows. There were claw marks on the windowsill. Everything inside me clenched. My breath caught, and for the first time, I began to consider my mother's words. When I lay on the bed, I couldn't sleep because of scratching noises in the guest room. They weren't rats. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was carving something. I didn't sleep a wink until morning. The sounds and the smell of her clothes in the air transported me back to childhood, when I curled up terrified by a thunderstorm. Back then, she told me nothing would happen to me because my father would always be with me. I knew all the answers were in the journal. When I picked it up, it felt like it burned my hands, and yet I started reading. It began innocently enough. Notes about my birth, how she cried the first time she saw me, that my eyes reminded her of his. She never mentioned his name. Then things got much stranger. Somewhere between love letters to my father, praises of his divine beauty, and descriptions of strange and horrifying rituals on how to summon angels. He came to me again, said he would take our son, despite saying before he wouldn't. He said he loves only me, and I should ascend with him. The neighbors saw him, heard him in the attic. No one talks to me anymore. They know who fathered my child. He said he'll come for our son soon, that the time has come. How could he do this? He promised I would go instead of our son. The last entry read, "I won't let him take our son. I'll do everything to stop him." I slammed the journal shut, fighting back nausea. My hands trembled with fear. I dropped everything and left the house. That night I dreamed of wings, not like the angel wings from Sunday school books, but huge and broken, with coal-like tips and golden roots. A distorted, wrong voice repeated my name. Michael! I woke to the sound of feathers sliding across the floor, but there were no feathers, only rising dust, and a smell like freshly cut grass and burning meat. The dreams continued, each time with more detail. Not just wings now, but a tall, gaunt figure with outstretched arms. It was always still. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its voice said my name like it belonged to him. Electrical malfunctions began. Objects moved by themselves. Deep claw marks appeared on the walls. The TV turned on to static at night, and blood would drip from my nose. I didn't know where to go or what to do, so I went to a priest. The old priest sat on a bench by the altar, bent over a prayer book. The moment I entered, he tensed, sensing I hadn't come to confess. "What brings you here, my son? I need an answer. I need to know what to do. If my father is an angel." The priest flinched like I struck him. He closed the prayer book and stood, his knees cracking. He stared at me like he was trying to see into my soul. "Who told you that?" "My mother. He's been coming to me in dreams. I feel him watching me through mirrors. Wherever I go, I feel his gaze. I feel something changing inside me. I'm so scared, Father." He placed his hands on my shoulders. His hands were cold as gravestones. "The angel you describe is not a messenger of love. He is ancient, more terrifying. Some of them were rejected even by God. And if one of them is your father..." He didn't finish, just stepped back and crossed himself. "You must reject him, renounce him, and never, ever summon or accept him. Don't look into his face if he appears. Such angels want to continue their lineage, and you will never be human again." In that moment, deep beneath my ribs, a thought stirred. Maybe I was never be a human. The dreams became reality. When I blinked, feathers floated in the air. I turned suddenly and saw his face behind the curtain, wide, frozen eyes staring. When I got the call that my mother died of cardiac arrest, a sharp mix of smells hit me. Burned feathers, meat, cinnamon, sulfur, and cut grass. He had been here. I heard my mother's voice. She sounded like she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Michael, my beloved son, he's so proud of you. Your father finally took me with him. Don't be afraid, son. He'll take you too, and we'll finally live as a family. You'll have a more important role, don't fear. Accept it. I love you. We love you." I vomited on my pants, paralyzed by terror. The smell didn't fade, it grew stronger. My first thought was that my father killed my mother and was trying to kill me too, using hallucinations. I tried to flee the house, but the TV turned on. The screen flickered, then static appeared. White noise, a chaotic swarm of dots. The static became rhythmic, like breathing, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud. Then the image changed. A silhouette emerged from the blur. At first just an outline, then wings appeared just like in my dreams. Its head was tilted, face obscured by distorted light. It moved, from inside the TV, coming closer with each frame. The screen lines warped as if he were pushing out, tearing through space. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Then, through the crackle of static, a distorted, inhuman voice said, "You are ready." The screen convulsed, and from its center a hand emerged. Long, clawed fingers, shimmering with both blinding light and shadow. The hand reached for me. I couldn't scream or move. I was frozen as he fully emerged, like a nightmare being born. He only vaguely resembled a man. His face was mine but twisted, terrifying, as the priest warned. He was corrupted by time and something unearthly. Tall and thin, wrapped in wings that shimmered like metal. His voice sounded like wind across a grave. "We are one family again, Michael." I passed out, I don't know how much time passed. Hours, days maybe, but I woke up on the bathroom floor in a pool of my own blood. I coughed, spitting blood, and felt something pulsing under my skin. My blood was changing. When I looked in the mirror, my eyes no longer looked like mine. They were his. A few hours later, I felt excruciating pain in my back, like something trying to tear its way out. All food began to taste like ash. Later, I started hearing whispers of prayers in different languages from mirrors, pipes, and inside my own head, and always, I heard my father's voice. Michael, you were born for ascension. I existed before the great flood. My ancient blood flows in you. You will have many tasks, but you will succeed, because I am with you. Always. I no longer needed sleep. My back slowly tore open as black stubs of wings burst through the flesh. He came to me yesterday, showing burning skies and oceans of wings, a throne made of eyes. His voice sounded like a choir of thousands. He said he would teach me to walk between dimensions once the wings were fully grown. According to him, they will break free within 2 days. My skin peels and flakes like ash, and my teeth fall out, immediately replaced by sharper ones. I no longer feel pain. I stopped praying for it to stop whenever I prayed. My tongue burned to ash and regrew. I stopped being afraid. The fear vanished on its own when I felt the air bend around me. I accepted it. I see other angels now like my father. They welcome me into their ranks. My mother stands among them, crying with joy. Now, as I type this, I saw the future, where I shine with light like my father. I now stand in fire, and soon I will continue the bloodline. Amen. My name is Aaron Evans, and some time ago I was the reason 20 people lost their lives. I am writing this in part to confess to the world what I've done and to describe to everyone the horrific yet eye-opening experience that brought me to this point. Let me start by explaining some facts about myself. I live in New York City and am the CEO of a massive company producing plastic bags, though I will not name it here. A couple of days ago, one of my factories producing high-density polyethylene suffered a horrid explosion, ripping apart a massive chunk of the building, with eyewitness testimonies claiming to have seen the roof catapulted tens of feet in the air. The blinding light of the event lit up the city for miles. It took fire crews working all evening to get the blaze under control, and several of them, despite their training and equipment, were scorched with severe burns or were coughing out their lungs from smoke inhalation. The colossal pillar of black, billowing fumes was still visible the next day, dwarfing even the tallest skyscrapers. When all was said and done, 20 people were confirmed dead. 15 of them died from the initial blast, and 5 others died from causes such as lung damage, asphyxiation, or burns as they tried to escape the crumbling wreckage. But that wasn't the end of the drama. As luck would have it, atmospheric conditions of the day had prevented pollutants from escaping up into the atmosphere, instead spreading their dangerous, noxious gases around the city. We denied that there could have been any such toxins dispersed at first to save face, but we soon caved under further investigation brought upon by the fact that multiple people who were near the factory at the time reported smelling something bitter in the air, substantiated by the surviving workers complaining some days later about headaches and nausea. We eventually conceded that it was likely that the inferno released ample amounts of hydrogen cyanide, and that was enough to scare the city into ordering people within a few miles of the factory to stay in their homes until the fallout could escape. Obviously, there were many questions that followed about how such a problem even came to be, but we had assured the public that we had investigated ourselves and found nothing wrong. It was eventually deemed a tragic accident caused by faulty wiring, the usual suspect. That was thanks to a fantastic PR team working diligently day and night to warp the narrative into whatever I saw fit. My name was clear, and I got off without even a slap on the wrist. But make no mistake, it was my fault, entirely. The story we came up with wasn't entirely untrue. It was faulty wiring that caused the initial fire that led to the explosion. However, the wiring would have never been faulty or exposed or nearly as dangerously close to the flammable chemicals had I listened to the concerns of the people who worked under me. I've always been a stuck-up rich prick, raised in a wealthy family, got sent to an elite private school with people in my wealth class, and inherited my parents' business basically immediately upon graduation. I never really had to fight for anything. It was all handed to me, and that, combined with how I was raised, led me to see the less fortunate as well lazy. If you're wondering why I'm telling you all of this information that will, well, obviously make you hate me, there are two reasons. One, I've since learned the hard lesson that most of what I believed back then is false, and two, it's necessary to understand the type of person I was. The factory workers had been trying desperately to unionize for years before the accident, and I fought them at every turn. Through successful propaganda, incessant delays, and the firing of most big advocates, I was always successful in busting them. Not only that, but they would frequently come to me with concerns. The place was outdated, to say the least. Old and rusty, it was clear many of the machines there had never been replaced or renovated since my grandparents owned the place. They barely even worked, and the rundown, decrepit nature was generating horrifying safety hazards left and right. But the machines were still running, so why should I have forked over the extra cash to replace them? Now, all of what I'm saying may be confusing to you. I know very well that there was no recent news story breaking of something remotely describing what had happened that night. And that's because, well, it never happened. I sense that this explanation leaves you with more questions than answers, so I guess I should stop beating around the bush. It was a couple of weeks after the accident. I had just left my penthouse apartment and was going to my block's local subway station. While crossing the street to the stairs I would use to get down to the platform, my eyes were glued to my phone, not even paying attention to the walking signal. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, a car roared into my peripheral vision. I didn't even hear it until its horn screamed into my ears. The sound of its tires on the asphalt of the street drowned out by my thoughts and the hustle and bustle of the morning city. My heart was shot with adrenaline as I leaped into the air, hearing the screech of rubber slipping on the rock behind me as I sailed and collided with the ground. I let out a half cry in agony as I slowly rolled over to my stomach. Once I had processed what had happened and finally stood up straight, a burning fire was lit inside me. "Hey!" I yelled, storming right up to the driver who was now running out of his car, the color now completely drained from his face. "Dipshit, watch where you're going next time." He didn't respond. In fact, nothing about him changed. He just stared head-on, his breath stuttering and hitching in several broken fragments. I rolled my eyes. I was running late. He hadn't actually hit me, so there was no need to get the police or insurance or any other party involved. And as much as I wanted to clobber this person for having nearly killed me in the street right then and there, I had more important things to attend to. And a couple moments later, as I was scrolling through my phone, waiting for my train to arrive, the incident was cleared from my mind entirely. There is a downtown _____ train approaching the station. Please stand away from the platform edge. I didn't hear the train number that was called. I didn't think too much of it at first, chalking it up to me being too distracted to pay full attention, as I often am. This whole procedure is so routine that I hardly even acknowledge the automated arrival announcements anymore. All trains on this color line were going where I was anyway. But now, looking back on it, this was weird. I had caught everything else perfectly, but when it came down to the number, I can't really explain. My brain just skipped over it. Something had been said clearly. I had registered that after the fact. It wasn't silence, and it wasn't gibberish either. It was as if I just couldn't process it. Like the sound had reached my ears, but the second it made its way to my head, I just shut down. And any thought back to it just refused to compute. It's hard to put into words unless you experience it. I boarded, putting so much autonomy into my step that I was almost a robot. And when I had made it into the car, I finally looked up from my phone, and for the first time during this whole ordeal, I noticed that there was something off. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Ashes, smoke, and a slight hint of something else. It reminded me of a scorched piece of meat at first, a weird combination of burnt food. Their scents mixed together so perfectly that I couldn't tell one from the other. In addition, there was an odd metallic scent, like that of a penny, and a hint of sulfur, even though there was only a suggestion of it. It was sickening, and I almost wretched as I looked up to scan for the source. Only, I found none. Everything was clean, immaculate even, as if someone had just gone through and polished everything. There was only one other person here, a figure sitting in the far back corner, near the door that exited to the outside coupling. He was crouched over on his seat, his entire body covered in a long gray, tattered cloak made of a rough, broken fabric with a hood that fell around his face, perfectly obscuring any skin. I had at first thought that the scent was coming from him, but that couldn't be. It had no discernible direction or distance, as if it was coming from everywhere. That was about where I had had it. No matter how late I was not about to risk my life by being alone here. I snapped back around, ready to gun it for the exit when, suddenly, the doors slammed shut in front of me. There was nothing to announce their closure, no beeps, and no stand clear of the closing doors please. Instead, they blurred past my eyes with such an intense ferocity that it almost made me step back to avoid becoming crushed in the giant metal maw. I stared, wide-eyed at the scene before me. A malfunction I rationalized. It made sense then. I barely had time to think about it, though, because soon the train roared to life. I almost fell onto my side, losing my balance as it jolted forward with a vengeance I had not seen before. The windows blackened with the overbearing walls of the tunnel, the only light that remained being those from the overheads, which radiated their artificial glow across the entire area, as well as the occasional flare of a bulb from outside. I collected my bearings and took a deep sigh to calm my nerves. Relax, I told myself. I can get off at the next stop. With that in mind, I slowly wandered over to the nearest seat, keeping whoever that hooded man was in my sight the whole time. He had not moved since I first boarded. The violence of the train's acceleration held steady. It required consistent use of my upper body to keep myself upright. We had hit our expected top speed a while ago, and kept going. The sound of singing wheels on track grew louder, the carriages thundering through the echo of the void we were plunging into. My stomach dropped as I frantically looked around the car in a panic. The figure was still staring at the ground as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But for me, it unnerved me to no end. Subways weren't supposed to go this fast. I began honestly believing that I might have been on a runaway train and that nothing would stop us. We were just going to keep plowing through the darkness until we eventually crashed. And that feeling, that idea of suddenly being confronted with my own mortality, trapped in a situation I had no possibility of controlling, sent the worst chills up my spine that I had ever encountered. I looked out the window, the flashes from outside having morphed into a single, vibrating straight line as motion blurred the individual fixtures together. And I just sat there. It was all I could do, listening to the thundering of the steel cars drowning out everything else as they rummaged through my eardrums, just waiting for the inevitable. But then we hit the brakes hard. All at once, I was immediately tossed from one side to the other. A violent shrill screech erupted from below as the wheels ground to a halt. I breathed a sigh of relief and closed my eyes as I tilted my head towards the ceiling. We would come to a stop soon, and then I would finally be able to get off this thing. I didn't care about how late I was anymore. I just wanted out of this. I would then run immediately to the MTA and give them a piece of my mind about the situation they had put me in. Who knows? I probably would have checked for grounds to sue them, just to be sure. The void outside gave way to dim, yellowish light as we were pulled into a station. I jumped out of my seat and practically sprinted to the door, which opened almost immediately as we came to a complete stop. I practically burst from the train, determined to storm up to the next employee and give them a faceful of what they had done. But those thoughts were put to rest almost immediately. Stepping onto the platform, I was assaulted with a tidal wave of warm, heavy, sticky air. This wasn't too weird. but the smell was a little odd. Wet and earthy, definitely better than what I had encountered on the train, but noticeable. Just a single look at the yellowish walls immediately pinned a culprit. Black spots dotted throughout almost every corner, crevice, and tile, spreading and expanding their influence like an infestation. Mold. The place was covered in it. The walls were also deteriorating, covered in shades and strings of brown, green, and other unsightly colors, drooping down their entire length as if they were melting, and the text, signaling the name of the station, had been corroded to such an extent that it had become unreadable. This may have been a bit more concerning to anyone else living in any other city around the world. However, any New Yorker will know that these sights are unfortunately commonplace, and I dismissed this as being a station I usually skipped on the express. The doors slammed shut behind me, and just like that, the train took off, the smoke of the violent braking still trailing behind it. And I was left alone. The other guy had not followed me out. I was still shaken up by what had happened, and being alone on a rundown, decrepit subway platform wasn't helping either. So, I just decided to walk until I found something to reorient myself. A dark pit within me began to fester as I observed my surroundings. There were no maps, no directional signs, nothing that could point me to an exit or at least tell me where I was. I was trapped within an endless maze of corridors with no sense or reason, just yellow-tiled walls. The lights above me were flickering, barely holding on to their exhausted bulbs that struggled to put forth their radiance. At this time, I was starting to have serious doubts about my situation. I didn't fully register the scale of what was happening yet, but the environment I found myself in was enough to put anyone off. The soundscape dominated by nothing but an echo of dripping water far off somewhere in the distance that morphed into a hideous whispering as it bounced off the corridors. This would be a perfect place to be stabbed. I could only think about it for so long, however, before the flashes from above increased in intensity, and the buzzing turned to far more of a crackling, static sound. Not a second later, hundreds of loud pops tore their way through the building. My eyes were hit with a blinding white for a microsecond before I became engulfed in sheer, absolute darkness. I stilled, my heart thundering in my chest as I tried to look around and find some way to orient myself. But there was nothing to feed my starved eyes. I was stuck here, standing in an endless expanse, unable to see myself or any part of my body. Was I supposed to wait here until someone found me, or stumble aimlessly, like a lost soul searching for salvation? That was when I felt it. A calm wind lightly feeling its way down the back of my neck, sending my hair straight on end, accompanied by something I couldn't quite describe. A lingering presence, pushing down on me from behind. The breeze moved slightly to the left, leaving my neck entirely. The sound I heard was barely discernible. A slight crackling started from behind me and slowly reached toward my ear, almost like the pop of bubble wrap, but a lot more unnatural, fleshy. I wanted to run, but I was locked in place, and I resorted to shaking uncontrollably. My breaths came out ragged and hitched, trying to keep in tears. Then there was the groaning, guttural, labored, broken to pieces, charred, as if trying to make a noise, but all that came out was a remnant of what once was. It filled my ears, working through the tubes like a parasite, joining in with the cool air, caressing my hair slightly as it drifted across my skin. And with that, I finally snapped out of it. I busted into a full sprint, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. The smell of smoke came back with a punch I wasn't unprepared for. It pierced through my nose, a sharp, acrid stench that combined itself with a hint of bitterness. I coughed, first a little bit, then again and again before I finally stood still, bending forward before letting myself succumb to an attack. I would know that chemical smell anywhere. It had been all over the streets since the accident. Finally, up ahead, a small sliver of light. I unsteadily shook my way towards it, fighting off the last of my respiratory system's wear. It was a dim, shaky glow, flooded with an inferno's deep, warm orange, but there was no flame. I watched as the shadows of the invisible pyre danced along the walls to the tune of an unfeelable draft. In the brightest part, sitting with her back leaned against the wall, was what appeared to be a woman. She was draped in a worn, tattered white dress, long since stained with splotches of gray that grew like an infection to cover the fabric. Her head was on her knees that were hugged closely to her chest. Long, crooked, silver hair was draped haphazardly around her legs, barely concealing the small, crusted paper in her hands. She was rocking slightly, her mouth letting out shattered breaths. The motion allowed the parchment to briefly peek out of its confinement. A small square with white borders surrounding something in the middle. A photo of what I couldn't tell. It was too dark to make anything off it. I stepped backward. A broken tile crunched underneath my feet and the woman stopped. I bolted as my survival instincts kicked in. Whatever was taking place, I didn't want a part of it. The woman's wailing got louder, echoing through the halls behind me. It was far more sustained now, no longer the pathetic broken excuse it once was. I could hear it as it quickly overpowered everything in the station. The absolute strength of raw emotion, the grief, the loss. The fiery glow surged ahead and colored the entire corridor. The dancing shadows having transformed into long tendrils that wrapped themselves around me, threatening to jump out and pull me into whatever nightmare this had become. Turn after turn, bend after bend, I prayed for an exit, for another person, for anyone I could talk to, and just some form of release. The lights flickered back on, and I now found myself back at the train platform. I don't know how, I was more concerned with what was lying on the tracks. I had never been more happy to see those silver snakes. Salvation. I bolted in through the open doors of the subway train, only catching my breath as they forcefully slammed themselves shut behind me. After calming slightly, I picked one of the nearby seats and began walking towards it. And then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, causing my blood to chill to ice. Sitting at the far end of the car was the cloaked old man, the same one I had seen on my first ride, with all the same posture. We lurched forward, accelerating with a force I was all too familiar with. I was on the same train. My heart thumped harder and harder as I stared them down. I desperately tried to forge some form of rationalization, no matter how far-fetched. But I came up with nothing. Nothing could explain the vast series of coincidences I was experiencing. I wanted to yell, shout at whoever was sitting bent over at the end of the train car, and demand to know what was happening. But a sound never escaped my lips. Instead, with a glimmering hand and in a last-ditch attempt to save myself, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and, without breaking eye contact with the only other person here, slowly dialed 911. The roar of the train made the phone difficult to hear, even on speakerphone, but I was a little relieved at the low tones that indicated ringing. 911, what's your emergency? The operator picked up almost immediately. The wheels were so loud at this point that I nearly had to shout to stay audible. Hi, yes, my name is Aaron Evans. I'm on a subway train headed dash. Hello? Hello? Can you hear us? A third voice joined in, and I stopped. Please, we need help. I can hear you, the operator said. What's going on? We're at the Static Factory in Lower Manhattan. Please. The person on the phone began coughing violently, and I could hear what seemed to be the sound of people yelling in the background, some with words, others just screaming in pain. We need help. There's been a massive explosion. The power's out and a whole section of the building's caved in. I'm trapped. Another series of violent coughing as a blanket of static came through the call. Sir, the firefighters are on their way, just to stay on the line for me. Okay? Please. The voice was weak now, barely able to cut through the extreme hacking. The fire's getting closer. Oh God. Whoever was on the phone erupted into tortured shrieks as growling flames overtook the line. I was unable to move or form a coherent response. His wails broke, morphing into a series of hoarse, rough moans. a deep guttural sound as the blaze ruptured his vocal cords. "Sir, sir, are you still there?" She was met with a series of 3 low-pitched beeps. Suddenly, I felt a burning, blistering pain drill its way through my right hand, radiating across my palm and extending to my fingers faster than I could react. I dropped my phone in shock and howled in agony as I clutched my right hand with my left. The phone smashed into the floor and I stared as white smoke poured from its destroyed screen. I looked up. The figure was still sitting there in the corner, having not moved, and now I had more reason than ever not to engage. The strange occurrences could no longer be explained away. This was when I truly came to terms with the fact that this was something greater than me, and the best I could do was try not to provoke whatever was causing this any further. Was that audio real? I didn't even know the person on the phone. Looking at it from a distance, they're just all statistics to you, numbers to write down on a clipboard for insurance or legal cases. I had never been so up close and personal with the victims before, never heard their voices, and hearing, for the first time, what was going on in that factory while the fires raged. I couldn't help but imagine myself in their shoes. What thoughts would be running through my head? Would I be able to handle the pain that this individual had experienced in his last moments? I shook myself out of it as I heard the brakes beneath the car. We emerged again, but not into a station like we had before. Everything outside was still as dark as the tunnel we had just shot out of. Even as the doors opened, I saw nothing, just the elevated tracks we were positioned on. I backed up slowly, for obvious reasons, not wanting to be anywhere near the edge, but it appeared I didn't have a choice in the matter because just as I reached my seat, a loud explosion tore up the space behind me. I was tossed forward as the train tilted vigorously on its side from the force, sending me sailing through the car and out the door. I spastically flailed my arms out in all directions in a panicked attempt to break my fall. And then I landed, and I swear I felt the bones of my forearms snap and ram themselves up through my elbow as my hands impacted the metal floor. I threw up from the shock of the pain as I rolled continuously, the world becoming a massive blur to me. Once I came to a stop, I lay on my back, staring at the tall, rust-colored ceiling, trying to catch my breath. My arms, as well as the rest of my body, were still throbbing. I dared to slowly turn my head over to my limbs as I desperately tried to hold in more bile from working its way up from my stomach. But they seemed fine. They didn't even look broken. That couldn't be. I swore I heard those bones shatter. I felt that forearm ram itself out of my skin, but I saw none of that. In fact, I could move both arms just fine. They still hurt like hell, but even that was beginning to wear off now. I stood up weakly, still dazed at what had just occurred and how I just seemed to be okay after a horrid fall like that. And that's when I heard the roar of a wall of flames erupting from behind me with renewed strength. My head snapped back at the furor that had been unleashed. Sheets of track, jagged and crooked, twisting and shooting off in different directions like a shattered corpse, came tumbling down from the above supports. The inferno formed a murmuration as it ripped side to side, front to back as if carried by some invisible draft. It shot forward towards me, the blistering heat submerging my face as it enveloped what was left of the thick, rusted railing. The blaze began to swirl, shooting up towards the ceiling and capturing the decayed infrastructure in its violent grasp. The smell of smoke attacked my nostrils as I was blasted from my side with a burning wind so intense that I had to make a serious effort to ground myself to keep from falling. And then, with one final whoosh, it disappeared from the ground up, leaving nothing behind. A new eerie silence crept over me as I was left alone in the overwhelming darkness, broken only by the occasional groans of what sounded like some unseen, heavy metal settling or colliding with something off in the distance, echoing throughout the entire hall. I didn't dare myself to move. I crossed my arms close to my chest and looked around, but I could not see anything now. I knew I wasn't going to make any progress simply standing here until I starved, and so I made the only choice I could have. I picked a direction and started walking, choosing to just continue forward, listening to the low howls of what appeared to be wind as it blew through the empty factory. A couple minutes passed, and then I heard something. It was far in the distance, barely audible at first. A few rhythmic taps that sounded above the ambience. I stopped, and so did it. However, when I kept moving, it resumed, melting with the sound of my feet. I stopped and listened again. I initially thought it was just the drip of water. But no, it wasn't that. Water doesn't just stop and resume on a dime. It doesn't sound this unnatural. I must have spun around multiple times, trying to pinpoint what I had heard while trying to make sure not to lose my orientation. It didn't make itself audible again, however, not until I prepared to begin walking again. That's when I heard it, louder than ever. It was a distinct, rapid slapping sound, as if something soft, smooth, and wet were impacting the metal floor beneath it quickly, over and over again. The sound of bare footsteps racing towards me. I leaped into action, sprinting with all my might, my lungs crying out in agony, but I ignored them. Those feet were gaining on me, belonging to a body I could not and did not want to see. In the distance, a bright white light emerged that scorched my unadjusted eyes. I had to dart my head toward the floor to stop it from tearing through my retinas. A loud snap resounded ahead of me, and I watched as the glow became blocked by sheets of jagged metal supports and insulation that burned with a crackling fire, raining down from the ceiling. I stopped and held my ears shut as they let loose a high-pitched shriek upon scraping into the floor. When I looked up, I saw my path forward entirely walled off with burning rubble and ruin. It circled me, providing no way out, all except for one small hole directly in front. It was nowhere near big enough to walk through. From where I stood, I debated if I could even crawl my way to the other side. There was no choice but to try. However, whatever was following me, seemingly now aware of my predicament, had picked up its pace. I practically dove into the hole, the exposed spikes and pieces of rusty metal tearing into my skin as I weaved into the enclosure. I forced my way through despite the pain. The material around me closed in far too tight for me to crawl, causing me to extend my arms out ahead of me and scooch forward, using exposed pieces of the ceiling, which were now jutting out of the floor, as leverage to push off of with my feet. It felt like the entire place climbed about 10 degrees in the span of a couple seconds. I could feel my face going red as sweat poured out of every pore in my body, my clothes sticking to my skin as they were wrenched in between the walls, squeezing me down from all sides. My lungs were crushed, forced into a deep compression that they would never expand from. Inhaling was painful, and every time I managed, all I could draw in was a weak puff of blazing air that seared my throat as it forced its way down, raising the sweltering heat even more. The light seemed so close. I just had to keep moving, but it became more of a struggle the further I got. The progress I was making was becoming less and less, a law of diminishing returns so harsh it would ensure I never reached my destination. I was opening new gashes on my arms and my legs left and right, and I could feel the blood draining from my body. Suddenly, everything around me shifted, and the ceiling caved in the last millimeter or so that it had, locking me down completely. I began to panic as I desperately attempted to inch forward. I put all my weight into my feet and pushed off, trying to drag myself with my hands, but no matter how much strength or force I put into the movements, I was stuck. I became more spastic, desperate. I was losing breath with each inhale I tried. "Please," I heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere behind me. It was pained and desperate, as if using its last breath to beg for help. The fire's getting closer. Oh God! I jumped, crashing my head into the ceiling, my vision growing blurry as I felt the crimson begin to flow down my face. Something had brushed my leg. Came again, this time slowly sliding down the limb's length. Its texture was rough, flaking, the failing sheet of skin that I could feel even through the fabric of my pants. A finger, multiple of them. I yelped as the hand clamped down on my lower calf. I shook my limbs fiercely, trying to get it off me, trying to break free, but it held on unrelentingly. "Please, We need help." The debris shifted again, and I heard the distinct sound of bone cracking as it let go. A shriek of suffering filled the tunnel as I finally broke free, pulling myself desperately, making progress inch by inch until finally, the light fully enveloped me, and I fell forward, colliding with the ground and tumbling only a few moments later. I got up on my hands and knees, breathing heavily on the very familiar dark, rubber flooring. I stopped, slowly turning toward the seats that lined the walls as the roar of wheels speeding down the metal track filled my ears. I stood up immediately, rubbing different areas of my body, checking myself for injuries. There was nothing. As always, the hooded figure sat at the far end of the car. However, this time, his head, while still obscured by his cloak, was slightly tilted towards me as if he was watching me with a peculiar interest. And I just couldn't hold it back anymore. A surge of anger bubbled up from deep below, and I yelled. "What?" I demanded. "The hell do you want from me?" Tears began streaming from my eyes. I knew that provoking this person probably wouldn't end well for me, but at this point, I had come to terms with the fact that I was never getting out of this situation anyway, and if nothing else, I at least wanted answers. What was happening? Why me? The cloaked figure didn't respond at first, but soon, I saw his chest begin to heave up and down. It was convulsive, jerky, snapping between the two positions incessantly. It grew in intensity as the head began to drift up and down. Finally, I heard what appeared to be small breaths escaping his lips. They immediately cut to sharp inhales before I heard the tone of his vocals. Deep, parched, dry, cracking laughter. It started gently at first before intensifying and harmonizing with the clicking of the wheels. We exited the tunnel and found ourselves above ground for the first time since all of this had begun. I turned and stared out the windows of the door. The sky was blanketed with a layer of light gray clouds. The sound of rain sheets pelting the train's metal exterior formed a symphony with the thunder and lightning that struck through the skies above. We appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. Nothing but trees in a washed-out, lifeless expanse. The train bit the brakes again. The figure laughed hysterically as we descended to a halt, where the growth finally led up into a broad clearing. I stared wide-eyed as the doors in front of me opened. Outside lay a field of 20 graves, all already covered up and filled in except for one. Surrounding the forwardmost center was a group of people, their faces obscured with black. They each held a candle with a flame that appeared purely white in the washed-out color grading, seemingly unaffected by the rain dropping from the skies above. They didn't even notice me, never turning their heads, never distracted from what they had lost. A coffin was being lowered into the ground. I tried my hardest to look at who was being buried, but the name, it was indecipherable. I couldn't even begin to make out the text scrawled on the rock. Another nameless individual. The train doors slammed shut, and I turned around and jumped at seeing the hooded one now standing just a few inches behind me. I don't know when he moved, but now he was right here. His hood had been completely removed, revealing a wrinkly, dark, dirty, burnt face. Loose strands of silver hair wavered off the top of his head in threads, barely holding on for dear life. And his smile, oh God, his smile bleeding, cracked lips with yellow teeth, a curve that stretched all the way to the bottom of his eyes that contained nothing but pure, unfiltered blackness. He tilted his head to the side, and I heard the popping of muscle and the cracking of old flesh as he did so. Then he slowly moved one shaky hand upwards, pointing at something behind me. I turned around, and I saw what he wanted me to see. Above my head was a list of stops. I scanned through each one by one, and recognized them immediately. My local subway station, that first stop all the way to now. And finally, coming up next, end of the line. My stomach dropped, and the train seemed to pick up speed as we rushed into the dark walls of another tube. I shook my head, the tears rolling out of my eyes. As I turned around, the old man began laughing again. He was beyond hysterical, and I could only watch desperation contorting my face as he began to shake violently, streams of blood draining from his eyes. This was all my fault. I could see that now. It had been abundantly evident this entire time, but now, at the very end, I finally saw it for myself. And so, I did the only thing I could do. I got on my knees, crying and begging. I apologized profusely for everything I had caused and done, and surprisingly, I meant it. I wrung my hands together, closed my eyes, and begged for forgiveness. I didn't expect to be heard, but I wanted him to know that I regretted everything, that I knew I deserved what was coming, and to make it clear that I would be better if I had the chance to do it all over again. And then, out of nowhere, we came to a violent stop. The jolt knocked me over onto the floor. I was forced to open my eyes as I extended my hands forward to catch myself. I looked around, shaking. The old man was gone and the car was full. People were everywhere, lounging on seats, distracted by their phones, or standing around holding the handrails, going about their daily business as if nothing had happened. A lot of them were staring at me, looks of confusion imprinted into their faces as if I was some sort of alien. I stood up, unsure of my surroundings, and practically leaped out of my skin when the doors opened behind me. I turned around and was greeted by a crowded platform as people from inside the train impatiently squeezed past me to get out. It was a stop I knew very well, my home station. I timidly stepped out onto the yellow line and observed what looked to be typical rush hour traffic. My hand found my pocket, and I felt something rectangular. My phone. I immediately pulled it out, revealing the pristine, undamaged touchscreen. I turned it on, and the display came to life. I nearly gasped when I discovered what was written on the top. Sunday, May 11th, 8:03 inch, 3 days before the explosion. I brought my hand to my mouth and began to laugh. I don't know why, I don't see how, but somehow, I had been given precisely what I asked for. I bolted out of the station and made a series of phone calls as soon as I reached my apartment. I ordered the factory to be closed temporarily and to put all employees on paid leave. At the same time, we brought in investigative and maintenance crews to go through the entire facility, update the equipment, and bring it up to safety standards. I must have spent millions and millions, but I didn't care anymore. It needed to be done. The factory is still closed, and I don't know how long it will be until it reopens. It depends entirely on how long everything takes. It's a big job. A lot of stuff that was left to rot for years is finally getting replaced. I'm losing money each day as I need to continue to pay my workers, but it doesn't bother me. I have the funds to do it, and preventing the disaster that happened before is far more critical. I had a conversation with the union leader the other day. He was surprised by my sudden change of heart. I can't be the person I once was. Not anymore. The maintenance workers found the loose electrical wiring that had sparked and set off the chemicals today. The press described it as a close call that was narrowly avoided. I'm being hailed as a hero now, but we all know that's not true. We all know what it took for me to change. The memory of it, of what I did, still lingers in my head at night. It haunts me when I go to bed, and that's the point. I will need that eternal reminder to keep me on straight and narrow and show me what could happen if I ever turn on my promise. Speaking of which, I want to say one more thing before I part ways with you. I can see it now. The train, I saw it for the first time again while walking to the metro on May 12th. I was scared at first. I didn't understand what it was doing here. I was doing everything right, wasn't I? Why had it come back for me so soon? And then I realized it wasn't here for me. I saw that clearly as I watched someone else, a burly guy, seemingly in his 40s, board the train before me, locked into his phone just like I was. I could only look on in half pity as the doors slammed shut behind him, and he finally looked up in surprise. The train pulled out of the station with the strength I had now grown used to, and I watched through the windows as the cloaked man, sitting in his typical seat, passed by me. And I swear he was looking back at me,